Hello, listeners, and welcome to Privacy Chats with Rachel and John, a podcast for privacy professionals and enthusiasts alike. I'm John.
I guess I'm Rachel. I think we did that backwards.
It's amazing we haven't done that yet. So thanks for following my lead. Or anyway, well, whoever we are definitely your hosts.
Yes, that's us. We're Rachel and John, however you want to put it. Okay, what's on your mind this week? This is your episode, Rachel. What are we talking about here today?
Yeah, I thought it'd be a timely, episode to use to investigate this new trend developing around my corner of the internet. And it's about decentralized social media platforms. So hence this episode is to investigate those further.
Love it. So tell me more. What prompted this?
It all started pretty recently following a conversation I was having with my mom about the future of social media. We're both really honestly concerned about the future of democracy here in the US. And without getting too much into the details, one of the commonly cited causes for how this mess came about is the fact that social media itself and, the centralized nature of it. Yeah. We talked a lot, but long story short, like she offered this idea that decentralized social media platforms could fundamentally alter the future of social media itself, and ideally for the better. So my research here is, orients around decentralized platforms, what they are, how they work, using one platform in particular to drive this research, and to more of my interest as a privacy professional, how privacy and data practices are managed on a platform like this, and whether it really could be the next future in today's socio-political climate.
I love that. And I also have concerns about the future of democracy for stuff that's going on right now. But, it's really for reasons that are out of scope for social media platforms. But I think I know what you mean, and you probably somewhat agree with me. I have heard a little bit about these decentralized platforms. Do you think this like these new platforms or this structure of things would solve this problem that we're talking about with democracy?
Yeah, I'd invite listeners just while I'm uncovering my research to kind of think about that too, because I think as a pragmatist before getting into this, it was hard to imagine an alternative model to how it currently works today, especially considering the business model. I also think, the most perplexing challenge of my lifetime and for my generation might be how societies can maintain the use of things like social media while also, allowing for sensitive, cordial, and ideally like fact-oriented dialogue around political discourse specifically. And so at the same time, I might be a skeptic of sorts, but I do think any attempts at solving that challenge are more than worthwhile.
I fully agree. Yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. But there are already billions and billions of people around the world who are using platforms like, Threads and X and Instagram, TikTok. So it's hard to break into that. The longevity of any new app really comes down to gaining followers and retaining users, and you have to get your foot in the door somehow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This idea really first caught my attention like around the election, going back to like what prompted this.
Yeah.
In November, I started seeing a lot more discussion going on about people leaving those platforms that you mentioned and going to others like BlueSky, which we'll talk about today, Mastodon, and specifically to be away from X, Threads, etc. I took a lot of time in the last couple of weeks to try to unpack how these apps work and what actually differentiates them from centralized platforms and whether privacy could be a key selling point.
I think it would be. It certainly would be for me. I was recently thinking that if a new platform came along that went back to, kind of the roots of social media and just served as a platform for people to share information and ideas with each other instead of what it's become of, harvesting our data and manipulating. Maybe that's too strong a word, but I'm going to use it anyway, manipulating what we see and monetizing us through targeted advertising. So like it's become such a big monster that if something were to come out that wasn't that and it was just simply a platform to allow the sharing of ideas, I think I would be all in.
Yeah. And so I love that you mentioned that because there's another good reason that I think we should be drawing our attention to this, even if it's just out of curiosity at first. there was a surge around that time of the election to daily user counts on BlueSky specifically, which
Okay.
is Twitter's alternative, so to speak. And we're talking about 25 million users, before it was in the couple hundred thousand. So that is a drop in the ocean, I guess, compared to Twitter, but it's enough to indicate a trend in interest.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, turn your, you can't ignore 25 million people. But that was particularly the timing that was more due to political appeal. I'm assuming. Then there have been some claims that some social media apps are more left wing or right wing. Like, where does this fall with all of that?
Yeah, I think that was a good like catalyst event. Like there's definitely an element of boycotting the legacy platforms if you
Yeah,
consider that having a big hand in how the election played out. Um,
sure.
from what I can tell, the platform we're talking about, BlueSky, it seems inherently politically neutral. But because of the surge in popularity, I don't doubt again that that was the kind of straw on the camel's back to migrating there as a user for a lot of people.
Okay, so yeah, I'd love to hear more. So yeah,
Cool.
say
Start with the
more.
facts.
Yeah,
Blue Sky started as an initiative spearheaded by then CEO Jack Dorsey in 2019. Many of our listeners probably are very familiar with Jack Dorsey.
yeah,
So it was initially incubated here within Twitter, but then split off in 2022. It's now led by a CEO, Jay Grabber. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which for the record is female. Awesome. Jay is kind of like a gender neutral name. I mean, we're
sure.
not a lot of female CEOs out there, so I want to shout that out. But it launched as a beta and as an independent service in early 2023.
I'll echo your shout out to Jay. Good for her. But 2023, that's really young in terms of looking to become a major online platform. That's just a baby.
Right. And while originally associated with Twitter, it's evolved into its own completely separate entity with a broader mission to very loudly like promote decentralized social networking here. So it's a baby, but it could go somewhere.
Yeah, conceptually, I think I like the idea of decentralization, but we haven't really explained what we're talking about there. So let's get into what are we talking about when we say a decentralized platform for social media?
Right. And hang with me. I'm going to get a little bit in and out of the weeds here. But
Okay.
put simply, decentralized platforms are networks that operate on various independent servers and or on a blockchain. So there are two different maybe avenues to split this one definition. It is characterized though wholly by the fact that it is not controlled by a single entity or confined to a centralized server.
Okay, so is Blue Sky then, which seems to be like one single entity, is it decentralized?
Yeah, and it's called that branding and marketing wise. Part of my research here was to try to make that decision for myself, since I'm not really sure how official like this one definition that floats around about decentralized platforms are.
Okay.
So Blue Sky itself is technically a wrapper or a managed application layer on top of what's called the AT protocol, the authentication, I think, transfer protocol.
Yeah.
Um, the protocol is federated, quote, quote, in nature, meaning it allows different users of different platforms to communicate regardless of the site that they are logged into through, their platform or technically the origin of also the server serving that data.
Yeah, I've got all of these thoughts in my head about the layers and the structure of different
The
like
OSI stack.
network protocols, the OSI stack, and the IP models and stuff like that. So I think I get it, but we are getting into the weeds here a little bit. But anyway, so let's say each of us are on two different social media platforms. So I'm on X and you're on Threads. I want to follow your updates, but I'm on a different platform. Will this, underlying AT protocol that the others wrap around, will that serve as the bridge between us that I can be on one platform, you're on another, and we can kind of still see each other's content?
Exactly. That's what I gleaned based on, again, coming fully from technical documentation. I'd say even an equal analogy would be that AT protocol acts as kind of the translator between the two. So it
Yeah.
converts the data from your platform into the right shape and format in order to be presented to, say, the other users or my social media interface. And this protocol can be used by app developers too, which is something neat about these decentralized technologies popping up.
So just to look at the comparison then, from a centralized app, this protocol doesn't require information to be passed through a single company's servers. It's interoperable, kind of like the OSI model that I've got in the back of my head.
Yeah,
Or I guess it's some, if we were to equate this to how email works, we don't both have to have email accounts on the same, MSN or Gmail or whatever to be able to send messages to each other. They're
right.
interoperable.
Right. That's another awesome analogy. And the nit with the earlier one is that, it doesn't sound like this would work between specifically an X or a Threads, as far as I can tell. The protocol itself is what provides that interoperability, but both apps need to leverage it in order to communicate.
Yeah, I get that. And then developers would be able to create social media apps on top of the protocols.
Exactly. So the BlueSky being the wrapper part, it's just the user-friendly kind of application layer that we interact with on top of it, where everyday users can literally, just like a Twitter or an X, create an account and get started just like any other social media platform.
I get that. I've heard about Mastodon, which is another popular decentralized platform. So does Mastodon work the same way?
I looked into this too. I had a similar question. It is, but it does use a different protocol. And theirs is
Okay.
called Activity Pub, assuming activity publication or something somewhere. It appears to be a more simplified version of the AT protocol, and without getting into the weeds, it handles stuff like account portability, or how you can take your metadata from one domain to another, and network scalability. So how many different accounts you can theoretically reach using it, just due to the specifications of how the protocol manages that traffic of data from one point to another.
Yeah. So thanks for that clarification. We are getting way into the weeds here. This, but it's super interesting, and I keep thinking about like some of the development work that was famous in the 1980s of the birth of the internet.
First networks,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So and there, clearly there's some smart, talented people who are out there creating all of these things, which is
Yeah.
awesome.
Still, yeah, and for a good purpose, based on at least what I've read and seen, especially around the more marketing and branding side of stuff like BlueSky.
Yeah, but for our perspective, because this is privacy chats with John and Rachel, or Rachel and John, depending on which order you're going to put us in. But so we're talking about so how tie privacy back into this, privacy and data protection. How does that factor into how these social media apps would function and be structured?
Yeah, and I kind of on this point, I had a hard time grasping how apps like BlueSky can scale to almost a million users eventually, with still truly being decentralized. So I did some
Mhm.
research on that, and there was a blog post from a dustycloud.org. I'll plug that in the description, that helped shed some light on this particular topic for me outside of BlueSky's blogs and informal publications.
Okay, you're scaring me about being in the weeds here.
Books.
It sounds like we might be getting more technical, but keep going.
Maybe a little bit. Sorry, guys. The AT protocol leverages social graphs, not unlike, a Threads or a Twitter. And when I say social graph, for listeners who might not be in the social media sphere specifically, this is simply your history of activities, the relationships between other accounts, posts that you make. And it supposedly handles this social graph without compromising the integrity and completeness of the data in the process, which was great to read. This is something that Mastodon's apparently underlying protocol struggled with.
So if we were communicating on Mastodon and I replied to something that you published, there's a chance that this might not show up on your app and there'd be kind of a gap in the communication thread.
Exactly. There were a few cases of that.
Yeah, that's not good. And there are some privacy implications, that some red flags starting to go off in my head here.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is definitely a tough sell. But again, those are nuances between the protocol too. So again, not
Yeah.
all, I guess, decentralized platforms are made equally the same in that way. But how does BlueSky work around this if they're, so similar? It turns out there is some degree of centralization in the protocol, where although the underlying protocol allows for this undisrupted and unmediated communication, like the app needs some way to gather, filter, and present the data to you as a user.
Okay. How does it do that as a
So
decentralized platform?
Okay, I'm going to break it down a little bit. There are
Okay.
three components that prop up BlueSky in again, leveraging their underlying AT protocol. There's
Okay.
something called the personal data server, which is exactly what it sounds like, the relay,
Hmm.
and the app view. Your personal data server is just what it sounds like. It's a big repository of your data on the application. The relay is like one big superhighway, comparing it to how cars use roads, that
Yeah.
aggregates as much of the data on the network as it can to feed it into eventual user app views, or as mentioned earlier, like the app views as that third component will be the piece that filters data to show you what's relevant in your UI as a receiver.
I get that. I'm trying to wrap my head around pieces of this. Like, yeah, obviously the data has to go from one place to another. There there has to be what's the
It has
mechanism
to
for
work like
getting
this, right?
right. Yeah.
um, So I guess developers can set up their own BlueSky relays, but those relays will, as designated, will set up to communicate only with a small slice of the network they stand up, kind of like how I understand corporate intranet works as a comparison.
So many social media networks, they'd really be self-contained then. Is that what we're saying?
Right. On the, self-developed end, I guess. And these relays like really connect the mini networks. But the thing is with developing on top of this protocol is that maintaining and supporting relays is quite expensive unless the network is really large and has a lot of users already. So it doesn't sound totally practical for just like you and I to just go, hey, let's stand up a privacy chats like instance of our own on the AT protocol.
Yeah, until we get to some quantum storage capacity, something, but the storage capacity feels like it just grows and grows and grows. So we're going to get
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no, maybe. And I like to think in the perspective future kind of science fiction-y realm there is
Sure.
I know we're getting closer. Um, but a truly decentralized network, and how that could work. I know they're probably smart people that can tell me a lot more about this, but it just seems completely outside of my depth to try to explain, where there's not any centralization of any sort going on here. But apparently I have to do more research on this, but the blockchain-based social media decentralized
Yeah.
platforms are supposed to solve this problem. Again, I'm a skeptic, so need to look into that. But the information is also just wasn't as accessible to me, so I didn't go on a rabbit hole there with that angle.
Yeah, I get it. So let's move past the architecture stuff and get us out of the weeds here a little bit and back
Sure.
to our privacy talk. As a user, how is the privacy of my data being handled across this super highway that you were talking about earlier?
So to guarantee that data is, accurately transferred across the entire network, this
Okay.
relay or the superhighway needs to send all activities down the network across all connected servers. So inherently, all activity data is passed through the network. And even in its documentation, it says it's assumed to be public.
Yeah, I get it. I'm trying to wrap my head around because that having to happen at the scale that you're talking about would be huge. And I get like the amount of data that's moving and the amount of storage that's required for it. But we already talked about the storage limitations.
Yeah.
But I'm not familiar with all of the capabilities that BlueSky provides. So can you give me an example of what you're talking about here?
Yeah. Outside of like obvious stuff, like they're very clear that all of your account, you know, activity, your posts and stuff, it's inherently public. There's not like a Threads or an Instagram where you can lock it down and make it private only to a select few. I imagine that's kind of what creating your own instances of the application are for, maybe on a more developer basis. But a good example of how to describe like why this transfer of data so interesting being made public is about account blocking. So if I block you, which is a capability on BlueSky currently, John, then the update will proliferate throughout the whole network as I just described. But apparently that means anyone can, if they're, able to access, the protocol to write some code to discover that I've blocked you, as well as anyone that's ever blocked you.
That's a bit alarming. So just, I guess, note to self, be careful about what you're posting until all of these things get locked down, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe
And
kidding.
maybe it's worth me going the developer route, maybe eventually to see these things for myself. A lot of this was based on research of people that, seem a lot more technical than I. But I'm still not convinced that maybe from that angle, privacy is inherently optimized on this. Decentralized networks have also been called the Fediverse, which are these
Love
like
it.
apps that these ecosystems, yeah, and the ecosystems around them are nicknamed. But let me switch gears a little bit here. I was curious about what Blue Sky's general like privacy practices look like and how they compare to centralized platforms, considering that they're their own big app on top of their own protocol. Like they should have these sort of notices and stuff. So I read it top down and noted a few interesting points.
Kudos for that. I'm usually the one who reads privacy notices from top to bottom. But so I'm curious to hear what you learned from that. But when you say Blue Sky, you're referring to the entity that I guess owns and runs the Blue Sky app that we're talking about, and not necessarily the developers that are working on the protocol that you're describing.
Right. And even in the Blue Sky's privacy policies, they indicate that like developer applications may have their own privacy policies when they're kind of talking from a user perspective. And so they
Sure.
encourage users to review those before using them. It's kind of like proceed at your own risk. This is just talking about Blue Sky's application. But
Okay.
generally, it looks like Blue Sky collects a lot of the same data that quote unquote centralized platforms also do to operate the service. That's information that's provided directly for user or account creation, posts, which, like I said earlier, are supposedly public by default, and contact information for reaching out to Blue Sky's team directly.
Yeah, that all sounds perfectly reasonable, and the fact that it's all out there in their privacy notice is important. So that
Yeah.
sounds good to me so far. Thumbs up.
Yeah. They also use personal information of users for, quote, direct marketing, security, analytics, creating de-identified and or aggregated information, enhancing and improving their app services, developing new products and services, enforcing their policies, and carrying out activities that are required to comply with new legal, or sorry, not new, sorry, with legal obligations, end quote.
That all sounds, I guess, reasonable. It sounds almost cookie cutter from what you would find in a lot of other things, and there's a lot of room for them to do things that we might not want them to do
Yeah,
in
this is a
some of
direct
those.
quote too. So
Yeah, I get it, but I'm kind of waiting for you to surprise me with something that we weren't expecting from a privacy notice.
okay, so here's something that it took me back a little bit, and it's related to their section on third parties. Here's a direct quote. We may disclose personal information to third parties for a variety of business purposes, including to provide Blue Sky app services, to protect us or others, or in the event of a corporate transaction.
Like, so they're setting themselves up for a merger acquisition to be bought out.
I suppose, and transparently, like I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure how unusual this sort of like clause is. Again, for apps like this, I have no idea. But the angle of from the perspective of the user reading this policy, I'm a little like it's a little ominous because like Blue Sky's whole branding and marketing is around being good for user control over their data. It's been hard for me to like separate where this marketing message, applies to the Blue Sky app and then also the AT protocol because they're inherently different. So a comment there. It is a little ominous.
Agreed, and I'm not a lawyer either, so I'm sure that they're getting, these things are written by lawyers, and I'm sure there's reasons behind it. But yeah, I would have preferred to see it a different. I don't know. It doesn't. Anyway, so who owns Blue Sky? I don't think we've. I mean, you mentioned who the CEO is,
And it
but
was once
who?
owned by Jack Dorsey, yeah, but
Right.
not who does now. I'm not
Right.
actually 100% sure. It's opaque because Blue Sky right now is considered a public benefit company, so they're not apparently required to disclose exactly who owns it. And all I know is that it's definitely like American owned and operated, inferring that they split off from Twitter, which is also American owned and operated.
Okay, well, for now. But to your comment on Blue Sky's marketing strategy, are you suggesting that Blue Sky doesn't allow the user data control the same degree that they advertise? Like,
Not necessarily. Like their policy does have a plain English description of how Blue Sky honors the rights of data subjects, how to access, remove, correct, delete, opt out, and opt out again on some data processing activities, also
okay.
on withdrawing consent, information about which third parties are likely receiving your data and for what purposes, and so on.
Yeah, and I love the plain English description because policy notices can be too. The ones, lawyers like to write things lawyer ways that they do.
Yeah.
Um, But I'm guessing that they're also subject to disclosures to law enforcement and things like that. Like there's some,
Yeah.
state and regional laws that they have to abide by with stuff like this.
Yeah. Just like any other large online platform nowadays.
Yeah. So it seems safe to assume that they're under the radar of regulators. Like, I mean, their size isn't huge, but they're starting to get up there. Like, are there regulations that they have to abide by?
Yeah. So Blue Sky is, it looks like in scope for the Digital Services Act, the DSA, and the Digital
DSA.
Markets Act over in the DMA over in Europe. But it doesn't meet the threshold to be defined as those VLOPs or very online, large online platforms quite yet.
Quite yet. What
Yeah,
does that mean?
yet. If they've surpassed 45 million users, which they're a little over halfway there at the time of this recording, they'll have 4 months to meet the additional requirements set by the European Commission, who's basically the executive governing arm of the EU.
Yeah, so that threshold of 45 million users. That's a good Jeopardy question. If there was a Jeopardy version for, I
DSA
don't know,
Jeopardy.
privacy. Yeah, I guess. Um, so good to remember if we're taking a test on that at some point in the future. Speaking of governing, so let's go back to something you touched on earlier. How is content moderation supposed to work on platforms like Blue Sky, or like are developers creating apps on top of it? How does their content moderation work?
Yeah, and according to Blue Sky's blog, and I don't know if the blog meets the same scrutiny or like is as molded by like lawyers as in terms of service or privacy policy, but
Yeah,
I'm hoping
probably
it's
not.
just as accurate anyway. They have this stackable approach to content moderation. So there's
Okay.
already automatic moderation services running by default in the background if you and I were to download the app and create an account right now. And these are aligned to their community guidelines, but they also have user developed content moderation tools available. So in the same way that people can subscribe to or follow other content on typical social media platforms, Blue Sky users can also subscribe to content moderation controls, or what they call as labels. And as the name suggests, labels will find content based on the developer's specification, that, the people that created the moderation tool to begin with, that can fire
Mhm.
warnings to you as a user when you're presented with that content, or it can be hidden from your feed altogether.
Yeah, it sounds. I'm not fully sold on the whole, democratizing of content moderation. I get the arguments on both sides. I'd be interested to see over the course of time how it plays out. Like, and I'll just throw out there, off the top of my head, Wikipedia is a platform for the democratization of information, but because it's not really moderated except for random people, you can't really rely on. Like in academia, you can't really use Wikipedia as a source,
Right.
because it's, anyway. But it's, so far this sounds similar to what like Instagram provides for turning off political content. Um,
Yeah, it's
and
interesting
maybe,
with the Wikipedia account. Like it's kind of like also a proceed at your own risk situation where you can certainly see like the cited sources if it's a
yeah.
like kind of self-governed page amongst everyone that's visited or used, a really high volume page, right?
Mhm.
And so you can at least trace the lineage back there, but it definitely doesn't apply to the entire universe of Wikipedia that's ginormous.
Right.
But yeah, going back to the content moderation on Blue Sky, this
Mhm.
model is pretty well aligned to their whole value proposition, right? Give users full control over the content that they're exposed to. And I remember reading in the blog that Blue Sky themselves had even recognized that their own team that builds and maintains, I imagine, the default content moderation um,
Okay.
isn't even going to get moderation perfect 100% of the time. Here's a direct quote. Our online experience doesn't have to depend on the billionaires unilaterally making decisions over what we see. And then they go on later adjust that, like, they're not going to get it right. But they call out that they don't, they're they're against
Yeah.
the billionaires deciding what's moderated.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, that sounds like direct references to some of the oligarchs that are out there and people making fun of these days. So that's, yeah, pretty funny.
I'm sure it does, and I'm totally here for it. Um,
So I'm curious about how far this pseudo self-governant content moderation will go, and whether that will continue to attract users. What do you think?
yeah, me too. It's somewhat of a niche app, like still at the moment, even with the amount of users we're talking about being in the millions. But it's definitely still tailored to users who are willing to put in that work to like understand how it's set up and how to manage and operate these controls within this community-based model. So it is putting more control, I guess, in the user's hands, but it's also more maintenance and administrative work, I imagine. I view it as a comparable to like how early internet blogs kind of worked, really by the people for the people sort of thing.
And I love that. It sounds like it's really a grassroots thing that's, starting, like you said, by the people for the people, which I love because, like I said earlier, I think that social media has gone really, really far from where it started of just providing some sort of a platform for us to share information with each other.
Yeah, I agree. And so to that end, I don't think it'll likely become the next like Twitter or Threads anytime soon, just because that barrier of entry is going to be a lot higher than folks are adjusted to with socialized social media nowadays. That's not to say that it's not a great tool, but I think I often think about how much convenience plays a role in decision making with people generally, and especially when it comes to online tools and how that has direct consequence to things like privacy in a lot of cases.
Yeah, as I've been thinking about some of this stuff recently, I think I keep going back to, and this is long before I was alive, so don't think I'm that old, Rachel, but thinking back to the industrial era and I don't know, the Vanderbilts and those people and like, Standard Oil, um, and you had these huge behemoth corporations that did, all of the oil and the steel, and they were all owned by individual people. And it wasn't that another company came along and you had another huge behemoth company. It was that, and I think a lot of those broke up because of, the Monopolies Act, but I think they would have broken up anyway. So,
Mhm.
and, I don't know if that's a prediction that I have but in future, instead of there being, two or three huge companies that control all of this stuff, that it's just going to, I don't know, the smaller companies are going to grow and it's just going to spread out over, I don't know, the world instead of, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but that was what
It'd be cool to
what's what I was
see.
thinking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean that really was the whole impetus of this episode, in the reason to investigate this. Like, what does a popular decentralized social media platform look like under the surface, but also like how decentralized it can really be.
I love the opportunities that might be available because of this. So
Mhm.
I'm interested to see how all of that evolves, I guess. And it's probably going to evolve quickly. Um, but what's your final assessment after having done your research on this?
I'm not I'm not necessarily convinced that this one platform we took apart today is as like decentralized, at least as it's advertised. But perhaps my definition inherently now of what decentralized is, or what I, kind of thought it was even going into this, was a little too strict. And perhaps it's not possible from, a real societal perspective to like nail that down again. Like I said, that's for people way, way more technically smart than me to figure out.
Yeah.
But it is hard to imagine how that could be possible with the demands of law enforcement globally, information security risks, and the maintenance demands for a platform that could respond to all these things, but in a way that's still easy to use and actually has other people on it.
Yeah.
I do like the idea though that users can build their own communities or even develop an app on top of a available protocol, and how users can, like we talked about earlier, bring their data and profiles from app to app and communicate across different apps using the protocol,
Hmm.
and assume the similar benefits are available on other apps that we didn't actually cover today, that we can experiment with. So I am just stuck on that also that one commercial transaction clause that we talked about earlier. I'm like, what's to stop the new owner if they do go through a merger acquisition from just totally prioritizing commercialization of the BlueSky platform over, say, the ethos of this like user control and portability that we do like.
Yeah, I can see that as a risk, and I agree. So, like I said, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves. And so, this was great. Thank you for doing the research on this. There's a lot to think about here.
Yeah.
Um, Speaking of lawyers that we mentioned earlier, we let's do our standard disclaimer. So before we go, please know that the information shared throughout this episode and all of our episodes is that of our own. It's not in any way affiliated with our employers or other organizations. These episodes are produced on our own time and based on our own research and professional opinions. And kudos to you, Rachel, because most of this one was your research and opinions. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. Thank you for engaging, and +1 on that to all of our listeners here. It was a good one. So
yes.
Until next time,
Okay.
see ya.
See you next time.